Hello, welcome to week 5 of the Quilt Code Along. This week we're going to be diving into a little bit of the construction, but that's not for you to do this week. We're kind of working ahead a little bit so you can see where we're going, and then next week we'll talk about accessorizing and customizing your quilt code a little bit. So this week you're just cutting out your pieces and getting ready to assemble, but I'm going to walk you through all of the assembly steps so you can see what that looks like. Alrighty, let me get my camera off and we will dive in here. Alright, so ground rules, just a brief recap before we get started. If you have a question, go ahead and hit the raise your hand button. I will be recording this. Your questions will be recorded, but your faces will not be, so don't worry about that. If you have a question, go ahead and hit that raise your hand. That's just going to start a queue so that I can just work through the questions in the order that they came in. Please keep yourself muted until the questions are open. We also have a Sew Along hub page. This is just on my website. This is going to have everything you need for the Quilt Code Along, links to all of the weekly blog posts, as well as a link to join the Q&A and our shared gallery, which you can upload your progress updates to if you don't want to post them on Instagram. And that is just at my website /Sew Along. Alrighty, so first things first, we got to get our pieces cut. So I'm going to walk you through how I do this, and we've kind of already talked about this a little bit. I'm just going to lay out my pattern weights and then use that 28mm rotary cutter vertically, just guiding it along the edge of my pattern piece with my fingers, and that'll allow me to just easily cut out the piece. Now, something to note that you may not have encountered before, these are called darts, and they are just markings on patterns for alignment later. So what I like to do is just take like an air erasable pencil and just mark on the back side of my fabric where those darts are so that I have them for alignment later. The really important ones for us, and I'll be honest, I'm not very good about marking all of my darts. I just kind of wing it. It's just my personality, but the important ones for us to mark for this kind of a pattern are going to be the ones around the shoulders, which is what you see here, and then on the sleeves, so around that sleeve seam. All the rest of them you can just kind of ignore. You're not going to need them. We just get those marked, and then we're good to go. Alrighty. Couple of quick reminders as you're cutting. You will see some pattern pieces. Most likely the only one you're going to see for a quilt coat is the back piece. Is going to have this place on fold marking on it, and usually just looks like these arrows pointing towards the edge. That's an indicator that you need to place that pattern piece on a fold in the fabric. And basically you'll cut out this edge. Don't cut along the fold, obviously. And then when you have it all cut, you'll unfold that and that'll be your complete piece. It just keeps your pattern pieces a little bit smaller. The other thing to note is that a lot of your pieces you're going to need to cut mirrored pieces of. So this would be the front of my quilt coat, and I need to cut one of them with the pattern markings face up and one of them with the pattern markings face down. The reason they don't give you two separate pattern pieces is because in most garment patterns, they're going to expect you to cut double folded fabric, which you can totally do if you've got quilted fabric. I don't prefer doing that because the quilted fabric that you're using for your quilt coat often is super thick and it's hard to cut through in a double layer. So what I'll do is I'll just cut out one piece with the pattern pieces right side up, and then I'll flip that thing over and cut the other piece with the fabric markings down against the fabric, and that'll give me my two mirrored pieces. You're going to need to do this for both your front pieces as well as your sleeve pieces. There is fronts and backs to sleeves, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but you'll need, mirrored pieces of those. You don't just want to have two of the same. Same thing if you've got like pockets or hood pieces, anything like that, that's going to have an asymmetrical look to it. Alrighty, then we'll dive into construction. Before I kind of walk you through that process, just a quick note, if you do have a pattern that is for a raglan sleeve, the construction is going to look a little bit different to what I'm about to show you. I'm going to walk you through the pattern that I'm using, which is the Patchwork Chore Coat by Patchwork and Poodles. It is a traditional piece one, so it's going to have shoulder seams and separate pieces from the front and the sleeves. Raglan sleeves are a little bit different. You actually make that neck hole from sewing your back and sleeve pieces together. It's all connected into a circle essentially. And those tend to be a little bit easier to sew just because these sleeve seams tend to be straighter. There's not as much curve in them. But if you happen to have a pattern that has that, great, it's not an issue. But you're going to end up connecting the back to the sleeve and then the front of the sleeve to the front of your quilt coat. There's no actual seam between your back bodice piece and your front bodice pieces. And so you'll just connect those into like a big circle, and that's what's going to create your neck hole. There's not really separate sleeve seams like I'm about to show you for a traditional quilt coat pattern. Alrighty, so here's how this goes. So the first step for constructing your quilt coat is going to be sewing those top flat seams, which is what you see there. This is basically going to end up looking like a vest when you're done sewing it. So we'll just clip those pieces together. I've got my front pieces that I'm just clipping to my back bodice piece, and then I'm going to sew those 2 4-inch or so flat seams. Not too bad. That's the first step, okay? And you can see I'm using clips here instead of pins. We talked about that. It's much easier to use clips on these bulky fabrics than it is straight pins. So if you've got wonder clips laying around for regular quilt binding, great time to break them out and use them. Make sure you are back stitching at the beginning and end of the seam as well. These are quilted garments. These are not quilts, so we're not ever going to lock the seam in later. So it's really important that it gets back stitched. I'm just pressing these open. You can press your seams however you want to press them. I like mine open because I press my seams open when I quilt too. It just creates a flatter seam, and there ends up being less bulk. You don't have to worry about nesting, but you can totally press this to the side or just follow the instructions for your pattern. It's totally up to you. All right, now I'm going to show you how to construct the hood. Your pattern may or may not have a hood. Most hoods are not going to get constructed this way. This is kind of unique to this pattern. But if you happen to have this, if you happen to be doing the patchwork chore coat, this is how it would come together. A lot of hoods are just going to be kind of 2 semicircular pieces that you're just going to lay right sides together and sew that back curved seam, and that's it. This one's a little bit different. It has this kind of insert to give it more of like a angled, faceted look, whatever you want to call it. If you don't have a hood for your pattern, it's just a collar. I'll talk about what that's going to look like in just a minute. But this is how a hood comes together. With that center insert, you're just going to match beginning and ending pieces, clip those in place, and then just ease the rest of the fabric around that seam, much like you would if you were piecing curves for quilting. Same idea here. Everything should line up pretty easily. You shouldn't have to clip into that seam or anything like that. It should just kind of lay pretty flat. If you've got excess fabric in one place or another, it's a pretty good indicator that you didn't cut your pieces accurately. Still doable, you can still work with that. We'll just end up doing some trimming later. It's not a big deal. Alrighty, so I'm just working my way around that seam. One thing to note about your seam allowances for garments, they're usually quite a bit bigger than a 1/4 inch. You're gonna have to check your pattern to see how much seam allowance is included in your pattern piece, but you should sew whatever seam allowance is indicated in the pattern instructions. For this pattern, I believe it is a 1/2 inch. And I know for me on this sewing machine foot, if the center position to the edge of the foot's about 3/8, so if I just give another 1/8 on the edge, I'll be good. I'm just gonna press that seam again, and you can see I was using my tailor's ham, and that just makes it really easy to get in around that seam. All right, now we're gonna repeat the exact same process on the other side of the hood piece just to complete the hood. So you'll see me walk through that real quick. Again, just pinning beginning and end, and that's pretty typical in garment sewing. You always want to kind of begin by pinning the beginning and ending so that you don't end up with any misalignments, and then just kind of ease the fabric in between those 2 points. Alrighty, just sew around that seam real quick, and then we will have a complete hood. And you can see here I'm doing a lot of adjustment as I go. This is 3x speed up. I'm sewing pretty slow. Just take your time on this. There is no rush. There's not a lot of seams to complete on these. It's not going to take you all day. So just take your time on this. Ease that fabric around. You can kind of feel around the fabric going under your needle to make sure that it's not lumpy or folded or you're not going to get tucks. Alrighty, so that's our seam. That's our hood. And what you just saw me do, if I back up here just a second, is the bottom of that seam, or the bottom of that hood, is basically this seam, and that's going to go around your collar. Okay, so if you happen to have a collar instead of a hood, you're gonna have this exact same shape. You're just gonna end up having like more of a rectangular piece, so it would be cut off right about there, and you would just sew that around the neck hole of your bodice, which we'll see in a minute. It's a little bit easier, but this is more or less, you can treat it like a flat seam. There's a little bit of a curve to it, but you'll just align those pieces and get everything sewn. So that's that neck hole that I was talking about. It's gonna start here and end there, just like that. So I'm gonna get everything as flat as I can and then just start pinning. And then we will sew that seam, which will attach our hood to the main part of our quilt coat. Keep those seams open. That'll make your life easier later on. With these quilting cottons that quilt coats are usually made out of, they actually press really nicely, especially compared to knits. Those seams will stay nice and open and flat. No big deal. Alrighty, and we'll just sew that seam. And then it will be on to the sleeves. Once you get your sleeves attached, there's not really a lot left to do it, and you'll see that here in a minute. It is just basically just a process of getting all your pieces attached to the bodice, and then once they're attached, you just sew a couple final seams, and you have a coat. It's really exciting, really satisfying. And you can see I'm using that stiletto to just kind of keep everything flat and feed it in. If you don't have one of these, definitely invest in them. They are also great for any kind of just regular quilting piecing, but when it comes to garment sewing and quilt coats, they are essential. It is a really nice tool, but you can of course use, a pair of tweezers or a chopstick or anything else like that. That will get in there as well. Alrighty, so now we have to attach the sleeve. I'm gonna stop there for a minute. So your sleeves are basically going to have this curved piece on the top edge of them. That is always going to fit into the armhole seam. I always put my sleeves in while everything is flat. A lot of patterns will have you kind of sew your sleeve into a tube first and then sew up the side seams of your quilt coat before you basically fit a circular seam into a circular hole and sew it in a circle. If you have a flatbed machine like I do, which a lot of quilters have, there's not really that tray that comes off where you can get into a circular opening. And so leaving it flat like this just makes the process a lot easier. It also makes that seam straighter and less curved, which makes it easier to sew. There is a front and back to your sleeve. Like I said, I'm not going to show you the markings just because they're really hard to see in this particular video, but usually you will have a steeper, shorter curve on one side than the other. Usually that steeper, shorter curve is going to go to the back of your bodice, and then the longer, less steep curve will go towards the front. But look at your pattern markings. There's usually 2 darts for the back alignment and 1 dart for the front alignment. And then there's usually also an alignment point for that top seam, which you'll see here in a minute. So you just flip it over right sides together. That's that alignment point I was talking about. So we'll clip center, clip beginning, and then clip the end, and then just ease the pieces in between, clipping everything in place, and then sew that seam, and that'll be your sleeve attached. Not too bad. Obviously, you want to do this very same thing on both sides, get both your sleeves attached, and then we'll sew the final long seams that go kind of up the armpits, and your quilt coat shell, in this case, will be completely done. If you are using a binding method, it's the exact same process, absolutely no different. You're just not going to see batting on this underside like you see on my quilt coat. And we'll talk about binding here in a second. I am not going to go through dropping in the lining today. We'll do that next week, but I will walk you through step by step exactly how to drop your lining in, which is what I'm going to be doing to finish this quilt coat because, again, I hate binding and I hate hand sewing. I don't do hand sewing at all. Again, take your time on these seams. They are curved. They're not tight curves by any means. These are not hard curves at all, but just make sure you're getting that fabric flat in front of it. And just take your time working around that sleeve to get it all attached. Pressing these seams, I don't think I show you any more of that, but those tailor hams that'll allow you to kind of get into a curved area and get the fabric flat enough to press can be really helpful there. If you don't have one of those, just work it down to the ironing board or ironing mat as best you can. It's not a big deal. Alrighty. So I'm going to stop there for a minute and kind of show you where we're headed with this thing. So here's what you should basically have. We've got front bodice, hood, back, and then the sleeves both attached. And these are super wide because they're still flat, right? I haven't sewn those things into an actual sleeve tube yet, and that's perfectly fine. That's what we want. Here's where we're headed. Okay, so we're going to align basically those. This was the beginning and end of that seam that you just saw sewn. We're gonna basically match those two seams up and then match your cuff and your hem and pin that all together. It's hard to see kind of on the video where we're headed with this, so I wanted you to have an idea of what I'm gonna try to do here when I walk you through the video. Alrighty, so here's what that process looks like. Again, beginning and end of that armpit seam, we're just gonna line those up, pin it in place. I'm gonna clip the cuff to hold that in place, and then clip the hem, get it all held together, and then you can really easily just straighten that out and it should line up perfectly. If it's not, I would say let there be some unevenness at the cuff and the hem. We'll just trim that up later. It's not a big deal. Again, that just means that you weren't super accurate when you cut your pieces out. It's not a big deal. It's totally fine. We'll just even it up. So I'm doing that same thing for that kind of sleeve seam. That's gonna finish that sleeve into the tube that goes over your arm. And then once you get it all pinned in place, it is super easy to just sew that seam because it's more or less a straight seam. I'm gonna do the same to the other side real quick. That's what you're seeing here. Exact same process. Once everything gets pinned in place, it's just a matter of sewing it. Let me see if I can fast forward myself a little bit here. Alrighty. Now, in the blog post, I did talk about how you could kind of start at this armpit seam and work your way out that way and then flip it over, start again here, and then work in that direction. If you're a little bit of a perfectionist and you really want to make sure that that seam lines up perfectly, I would recommend doing that. Otherwise, just sew it straight, it doesn't matter. But sometimes when you're sewing it straight, if you have a little bit of extra fabric in some places, the seam can shift just slightly. And so a great way to avoid that is to just start at the seam because you know it's pinned correctly and then just work outward from both directions to get your seam complete. This is going to be a thick region. If you need to kind of lift your foot up or use a hump jumper or something like that to get over it, don't be afraid to do that. It's not a big deal. Alrighty, that is one big long sleeve finished and your coat is basically together. Ooh, I don't know why it backed up on me. Let me just flip to the next one. Alrighty, so here's what you should have. It's basically a coat shell. Again, if you're doing the binding method, you're gonna have backing fabric on this, and this will basically be a complete coat. You're just gonna have exposed seams that we'll deal with in a minute. But if you're gonna drop in a lining, kind of use that birthing method, you will have a coat shell. It's gonna have batting on the inside, but you can try this on, you can make sure it fits. It's super exciting when this happens because it's more or less complete and you can see it come together, and then it's just a matter of doing some final finishing touches, which is super exciting. Alrighty. Let's talk about binding real quick. Again, I am going to show you how to do the drop-in lining method here in a little bit, but, I'll show you how to do that next week. I'm not gonna go through it today, but we'll go through that step by step, just like we've been doing next week. But for the binding method, here's how that would work. So you would just sew your normal seam, right? You're gonna have backing fabric basically exposed, which is why I've sewn this batting sides together. Most of these garment seams, like I said, are gonna be bigger than a 1/4 inch. So the first step then is to trim that seam down so that it's a 1/4 inch and it's easy to get a binding around it. I'm just eyeballing this. It's not super critical that it's perfect, but you could also use a rotary cutter if you really want to. And then binding, there's a couple of ways you can do it. The way I'm going to recommend is just using your regular old binding that you would for the edge of a quilt coat. So this is just 2.5 inch binding strips that I've folded right sides together. We're just going to line those raw edges up to the edge of my seam. And I'm just going to trim that to make it more manageable. And then we will sew 1/4 inch down the edge of that seam on the round edges just to get all of that binding attached. Again, backstitch at the beginning and the end. And then you've got a couple options here. So the first option is basically to just fold that binding around the seam just like you would the edge of a quilt, only it's going to be 2 layers of fabric now. And I'm going to pin that in place just to show you what it would look like. But to finish that, if you wanted to go with this method, you would just stitch down the side just literally just like you would the edge of a quilt coat. And then what happens is when you open that up, you end up with a very thick ridge of binding around that seam. Now, it's going to give your quilt a lot of structure. Your coat a lot of structure. If you do this, it'll actually act like almost boning around all of your seams. If you like that look, go for it. But it is going to be a pretty thick seam against your body. Might be a little bit uncomfortable. It looks uncomfortable to me. I'm pretty particular about my seams and my garments. So that's one option. The other option is that instead of kind of leaving it pinned around there, you would just press it all the way flat. So basically your seam is under here, it's getting pushed over to the side, and then we're wrapping that binding around it and just smoothing it out on the other side of the seam, and then just stitching down the edge of that in order to get it flat. The advantage of this is that you're going to get a nice flat seam against your body. The disadvantage is that you're going to end up with stitches showing through on the other side of your garment, unless you hand sew, of course, which is another option. Again, you know how I feel about hand sewing. Not a fan, so I'm going to avoid that as much as possible. But machine or hand, it doesn't matter. You're just going to get that stitch down flat, and you can see you're going to get some stitches showing on the other side, which will be the right side of your quilt coat. That's going to be the outside of your quilt coat. You can see this is pretty thick. This is about 3/4 inches wide. If you're going to go with this method, I would say start with maybe like 1.5 inch wide binding strip or 1 1/4 inch. You don't need the full 2.5 inches here. That's kind of overkill. You just basically need more than, I would say, 1/4 inch to 3 inch, 1/2 inch to cover over that seam and get stitched down. So that is how you would bind the seam on your quilt coat. If you choose to use that method, again, I'm going to show you a really, really easy way to just drop in a lining and use a kind of a birthing method instead that avoids all of that hand sewing, all of that binding. We will go through that next week. There was kind of a little bit of a sneak peek of that on the blog post this week, but just hang tight. We will walk through that step by step. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and open up for questions. How we doing? That was a lot. None of it's hard. It's just a lot of long seams. This should take you, I would say, probably an hour and a half. You'll have your completed quilt coat together. It's not as difficult as it looks. It's going to feel a little weird as you get started. Just trust the process. It's garment sewing. There's a lot of things going on, and it's also just like a big mess of fabric. Quilt coats for adult-sized humans are large. It's just the way they are. So just kind of lean into it. Trust the process. It will work out. There's nothing hard about this, and you've totally got it. Alrighty, let me look at the chat. Not seeing any questions. So if you have any that pop up as you're trying to construct your quilt coat, just drop them in the comments. I'm happy to answer them. What I would recommend for this week, and I will go to our reminders page, if you are doing the drop-in lining, for this week, just assemble the lining. Start there, right? Because it's the lining. Nobody's going to see it, first of all. So if you mess up, it's not a big deal. And it's less fabric. So kind of get some practice assembling a garment on the lining before you assemble your quilt coat. What I'm going to say is just cut out your pieces this week. Don't worry about assembling it, because next week we're going to go through kind of all kinds of accessorizing that you can add to your quilt coat. So that's pockets, buttons, both traditional buttons and toggle buttons. We'll talk about adding a zipper in there, garment labels, all kinds of fun stuff. We'll even talk about if you wanted to do like elbow pads, which I love on a garment. The only reason I'm not doing them on my quilt coat is because I don't have any gray fabric that'll match. The brown doesn't really look good with the colors I've chosen for my quilt coat, which is super sad because I love elbow pads. But we'll talk about how to add all of that stuff to your quilt coat. Again, doesn't matter if your pattern includes it or not. I'm going to show you how to do some really easy modifications that you can add it, and you can have something that's super unique and beautiful. So just cut out your pieces. A lot of those accessories are much easier to add if you have not assembled your quilt coat yet. So just cut your pieces, leave it. You know how to assemble it. That's how we're going to be doing it, but don't worry about it yet. If you're doing that drop-in birthing technique, again, you can assemble your lining and kind of get some practice there, but don't worry about the quilt coat part of it just yet. And then gather any of your finishing supplies. So if you want to add a zipper, you're going to need, a separating zipper that's long enough for the front of your quilt coat. It's probably going to be between like 30 inches or so, 30 to 36 inches, depending on the size of your quilt coat. I will link to a couple of shops that can provide those supplies if you are interested in the replay description on YouTube, so you can check that out. If you want to go a zipper option, if you're putting buttons in, go ahead and purchase your buttons. If you're doing toggle buttons, we're going to need a little bit of an elastic cord just to get over the button, so you need to purchase some of that. Again, I'll link to all of this stuff in the description. If you want to do elbow pads, you can buy kind of iron on suede patches if you want to. Those are a great option, but there's also some stretch vinyl from different garment suppliers that are a really, really good option for kind of adding those accents. You can also just do it in a patch of like scrappy quilted fabric that you have if you just want to add a little bit of contrast. There's lots of options there. But if you need to gather any of those supplies, go ahead and get them so that we're all ready for next week. Post a progress pic by Wednesday of this week, that's April 24th, in order to be in the running for, I am so excited about these. I got custom garment labels, if you can see that. I'm so excited. So you just have to have made 2 check-ins for the sew along, and I'm going to send those out to you in the mail for free. You don't have to worry about it. There'll be a sign-up form at the end of the sew along. If you've made at least 2 check-ins, you just drop your address and I will get those in the mail to you. They're iron-on, so you can just stick them on your quilt coat and iron it on. You can put a little stitch around the outside of it, which is probably what I'm going to do if you want to, but they will stick. They'll fuse with the iron-on adhesive without any stitching, and you can put them on the outside or the inside just to make you smile. I think it's really fun. So everybody's eligible for those. Like I said, you just have to have made 2 check-ins. Progress updates are literally just that. It's just a progress update. You don't have to be caught up for the week. Just post a picture showing you working on the quilt coat, and that's good enough. You can do that in the shared gallery or on Instagram. Just make sure that you tag me if it's on Instagram, because otherwise I have a hard time seeing the post. And everybody who participated can get one. It's gonna be so exciting. I think they're awesome. You probably don't think they're as awesome as I do, but I like them. Alrighty, that's all I got for this week. If there are any questions that come up, just leave a comment on the YouTube replay and I will definitely get to answering that. Have fun sewing.